As surely as we belong to the universe, we belong together. We join here to transcend the isolated self, to reconnect, to know ourselves to be at home here on earth, under the stars, linked with each other.
There's a debate going on among Unitarians, among some Unitarians anyway. It's about race, marginalized communities, empowering those who are on the sidelines. It's about how marginalized communities speak out, which apparently makes some uneasy, even some in the UU Church. The UU Church, generally speaking, has a tradition of liberalism, social justice, helping the oppressed. Some may argue that there is little debate on the issue inside the church. We're about empowering those on the edges, recognizing the marginalized. We realize there are wrongs out there and we want to right them. That's how I see the church, how I think many see it. But no, we're by no means beyond reproach. We don't have it all figured out. In fact, there is division inside the church on some attitudes related to race. And I'm talking about the UU Church in global terms. The broader societal debate on the issue exists among UUers as well. I don't say this to be provocative. I don't say it as a religious expert, an expert on race issues. This all actually is new to me. I say it as a layperson based on a review of the material that's out there, statements, blog posts, and more from UUers. There's a debate going on. It all flared up most recently with the distribution last June of the Gadfly Papers, a book by Todd Eckloff, at the General Assembly of Unitarian Universalists in Spokane, Washington, attended by some of the UUers here, though not me. The book offended many Unitarians with a formal censure last August from the UU Ministers Association. The UUMA stated that the logic expressed in the book, quote, has often been employed in white supremacy culture to stifle dissent, minimize expressions of harm, and to require those who suffer to prove the harm by that culture's standards, end quote. It's strong stuff. Who would have thought such criticism would be directed by UUers at UUers? But it's there. And the debate underscores a conversation in the broader community in these contentious political times. We aren't immune from the global discussion. Eckloff, who is white and male, is a Unitarian Universalist minister in Spokane, Washington. In his book, a collection of 3 long essays, actually, he argues in part that political correctness over sensitivity, as he sees it, has run amok in the UU Church, which again is a debate raging in the community at large. He leans on the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Coddling of the American Mind argues, ruefully, that a movement is growing on college campuses that, quote, presumes an extraordinarily fragility of the collegiate psyche, and therefore elevates the goal of protecting students from psychological harm. The ultimate aim, it seems, is to turn campuses into, quote, safe spaces, end quote, where young adults are shielded from words and ideas that make some uncomfortable, end quote. That's from Coddling. Coddling cites instances of law students asking professors not to teach rape law, lest it cause students distress. It cites the decision of comedians like Chris Rock, who can use blunt, raw language, to stop performing in colleges. It cites apparent calls from some for trigger warnings for students before reading books like The Great Gatsby, so they know ahead of time that they contain portrayals of misogyny and physical abuse. Eckloff, and it's controversial, but I want to offer up his viewpoint, sees that sort of evolution of thought occurring in the Unitarian Church. He laments what he sees as the emergence of, quote, divisive identity politics, end quote, a trend that lends itself, in his view, to division. Specifically, and this is where it gets more focused on the UU Church, he lamented the focus at the 2017 UU General Assembly on, quote, internal accusations of racism and white supremacy, end quote, stemming from a controversial decision earlier in the year to pick a white male for a Unitarian Universalist Association leadership post over a Latina woman, Cristina Rivera. That employment pick, which prompted Rivera to loudly call out what she called the white supremacy in the UUA, caused a big rift, criticism toward the church establishment that it wasn't doing enough to diversify. Eckloff, by contrast, said the situation merited attention, but he used the intense tenor of the controversy as a jumping-off point to scold the emergence of identity politics, to decry identity politics as ineffective. Eckloff writes, if not working in solidarity with other groups identifying with more common issues, efforts are unlikely to have enough collective support to be effective, end quote. Eckloff also noted with chagrin the outrage sparked last March by an article in UU World, a church magazine that focused on the transgender community, written from the perspective of a mother of a daughter who has a transgender girlfriend. Critics in the transgender community complained vigorously, and the magazine editor subsequently apologized for not getting enough input from the transgender community on the article ahead of time, and for putting the, quote, straight cisgender person's experience in the foreground, end quote, among other things. Eckloff, responding to such things, writes, quote, this is not to suggest Unitarian Universalism should not continue concerning itself with those grave issues of injustice impacting specific groups, only that doing so requires a corresponding emphasis upon our common humanity, end quote. Again, the focus on a narrow group seems to give him pause. It's okay to speak out more generically on issues of oppression, he seems to be saying, but some people and groups are overdoing it, he seems to think. When this criticism gets directed at UUers themselves, as in the Rivera matter and the UU World article, he seems to think it goes too far, can be counterproductive. Further on in Gadfly, Eckloff predicts a strong response from his book. And soon after he distributed his book at the Spokane General Assembly, the backlash would come, fast and furious, from critics viewing Eckloff, among other things, as lacking compassion. This comes from a statement by ministers of color from the UU Ministers Association. The material in question, that is Eckloff's book, quote, lacks both respect and compassion, continually asserting that if people of color would only be logical, things would be different. Unfortunately, since racism is not logical, logic cannot be a primary tool in its resolution, end quote. This comes from a statement by the Diverse Revolutionary UU Multicultural Ministries, or DRUM. Eckloff's book, quote, reintroduces toxic history and theologies containing transphobia, ableism, sexism, and targets people of color, and in particular religious educators. We, Unitarian Universalists of color, it goes on, know this will not be the last statement on harm being caused by our siblings who uphold a toxic interpretation of Unitarian Universalism that centers white people and culture. Me personally, I seized on Eckloff's seeming discomfort with militants with so-called identity groups speaking out and defending themselves, standing up for themselves. He levies charges of safetyism, speaks disparagingly of those he views as protecting their, quote, emotional safety, end quote. But I don't see the emergence of what he refers to as identity politics in the same way as Eckloff, not at all. I see those speaking out expressing their offense as people feeling more empowered, more unafraid. I'm white, male, pretty apparent, I think. Some of the clamoring in our current political climate makes me personally uneasy at times. But I say good for them for speaking out, not being kowtowed. That's the view I strive for. As the debate over race, over the place of traditionally marginalized segments of the community shifts and morphs, as it always does, I strive to listen. Listen and learn, change with the times, let those on the margins have their say, have a space, speak out. I don't say this to lay claim to some higher ground as a woke white person. I stumble sometimes in trying to keep pace with all the voices speaking out. But giving them heed just seems, in my gut, the approach to take. In closing, that Eckloff is the focus of so much criticism, even if he is a Unitarian, doesn't necessarily undermine Unitarian values. If anything, I think it underscores the fact that there is still a ways to go in addressing race, the oppressed, the marginalized, even within the Unitarian Church. This whole episode can be taken as a lesson. The journey isn't over, it never is, and we should all always be analyzing, questioning our own assumptions, trying to understand others and give them space.
I'm not going to ask you to announce yourself, but I think I'm not alone. I imagine some among you have at least once in your life been called out, whether it seems fair or not, for racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, or another injustice. If you're like me, this was followed by shock, confusion, feeling misunderstood, defensiveness, and self-doubt. Today, I want to throw you a life preserver for that moment. Or maybe even just a past moment that you still struggle to reconcile with who you know yourself to be. It is a quote by Kyle Wante Traumeier. Remember, white supremacy is not a shark, it's the water. That quote represents a transformational concept. Once I understood it, I was free. I lost the fear and self-doubt, and I was able to face accusations like that with curiosity and active self-reflection. I became resilient and able to learn from it. I want to expand on this with you. I consider myself well-meaning, tender-hearted, and a hopeful liberal. Like many people my age, I once operated on the fundamental belief that all guys, gals, and binary pals are equal. But as do all things change, this general acceptance is not really sufficient today. If you were taught to not discriminate, like I was, you were taught to dismiss the differences between ability, race, gender, and sexuality. But I have learned that it takes a different active participation to be fair. It's not enough to just not be racist or not be sexist. Instead, one is asked to be anti-racist and anti-sexist. It takes mindfulness to difference to be actively inclusive. Eckloff, the author Tim talked about, argues that we have gone too far, that we are going the wrong direction by playing identity politics. He suggests we go back to a time when we assume the best of a person's intentions and let that be enough. Eckloff minimizes the value of multiculturalism and attempts to use great writers like Wendell Berry, Martin Luther King Jr., and others to argue for this. I can't address them all. But for the point I want to make today, I will challenge his use of Wendell Berry. Eckloff quotes Berry saying, "The social and cultural pluralism some now see as a goal is a public of destroyed communities." He wants you to believe that this implicates identity politics, but he did not read the rest of the page. On the same page, Berry makes his thoughts clear. He criticizes people that regard the fierce self-defense of still-rooted cultures as fundamentalism, for which they have no tolerance at all. Barry is defending identity politics. Barry continues, if I merely tolerate my neighbors on the assumption that all of us are equal, that means I can take no interest in the question of which ones of us are right and which ones are wrong. It means that I'm denying the community the use of my intelligence and judgment. It means that I am not prepared to defer to those whose abilities are superior to mine, or to help those whose condition is worse. It means that I can be as self-centered as I please. Epcloff's biggest concern in his first essay is for the self. For one, to prevent the individual right of free speech. So let's talk about that. Look at our principles. Free speech is not in our principles. It's in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution of the United States. But even there, it's widely acknowledged that free speech is not absolute. Threats of violence, hate speech, libel, slander, they're not protected speech. But if the US law isn't our UU moral code, what kind of individual freedom are we about? The first principle is about the individual, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The fourth principle promotes a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. But responsible isn't about the self. Responsible nods toward the seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Interdependence doesn't erase difference. Being responsible for differences requires paying attention and giving them fair representation. As our fifth principle calls for the use of the democratic process in our congregation and society at large, democracy holds a really simple concept of representation. When we wish to represent a group, we let that group speak for itself. The autistic community has a saying, nothing about us without us. I think that works nicely for each minority group. This, Eclough believes, is going too far. He has polarized his thinking and shows an oversimplified view. It is both it's both a pessimistic view of our capacity for individual growth and an overly optimistic view of the progress we've already made. Let me borrow a metaphor to explain why we still need to grow. Imagine modern society as a premature baby. The baby's condition can be described as both bad and better. The baby's health status is extremely bad, and her breathing, heart rate, and other important signs are tracked constantly so that the changes for better or worse can quickly be seen. After a week, she's getting a lot better. On all the main measures, she's improving, but she still has to stay in the incubator because her health is still critical. Does it make sense to say the infant's situation is improving? Yes, absolutely. Does it make sense to say it is bad? Yes, absolutely. Does saying things are improving imply that everything is fine and that we should all relax and not worry? No, not at all. Is it helpful to have to choose between bad and improving? Definitely not. It's both. It's both bad and better. Better and bad at the same time. That's how we must think about the current state of the world and of the UU. The authors of this metaphor conclude that a world in which no one complained, in which we only celebrated how good we have it, would be a world that never improved. The spirit of progress is also the spirit of discontent. As a world, a country, and a church, we are progressing, but we're not done. We honor this truth in the third principle, acceptance of one another. But it doesn't end there. It goes on and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. So if we're not at the finish line, where are we? We're in the middle of another water metaphor. That's where. We're afloat in a vast and unsettled sea. The ship is called Progress. Together, we left the shore launched by the winds called emancipation and suffrage. We sailed away from overt oppression, slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, women who could not own property, people who could not vote and counted as a fraction of a person, hospitals filled with lobotomized, abused, and naked patients abandoned to their suffering. This land seems far behind us, but we have not yet reached the shore we seek. That shore, that place dreamed of in our sixth principle, a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Sure, there are people calling out among us. They are the lookouts in charge of warning us of incoming hazards. If no one's on the lookout, if no one calls out the hazards, the icebergs, the squalls, the great white whales, will the hazards disappear? Nope. We will weather far worse without them. Don't be confused though. If UU faith is that ship, Eckloff is not a lookout. He's leading a mutiny. He calls for a division. See, the online conversations are talking about him starting a new church. Eckloff has scrounged up an old decommissioned lifeboat named Tolerance. He wants to lower her and row away. I can tell you that boat could go somewhere. I don't know where or for how long it will float. I think Eckloff is trying to escape the wrong danger. Maybe you're worried about it too. So here's your life-preserving knowledge. That lookout, the one yelling racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, is not the danger. This is not the time to panic and run from them. Even if they yell directly at you, take a breath. Get curious about the shouting. You aren't the danger. You aren't a shark. And even if you were, we're not a hunting vessel. Look around you. You fell in the water. And as a loving community, we can pull you out together. Blessed be.